Every morning before dawn, the pilots of Operation Ranch Hand were already awake. Breakfast at 4:30, mission brief by 5 o'clock. Then they climbed into their C-123 Provider cargo planes, loaded with 1,000 gallons of chemical spray, and flew straight toward the jungle at 150 feet above the treetops. That low, the altitude was not a choice. Any higher and the chemical drifted off target. At 150 feet, the Viet Cong below could practically read the serial numbers on the aircraft. The planes came home riddled with bullet holes, which the ground crews patched. Again and again and again. One aircraft, nicknamed Patches, took more than 500 confirmed hits from enemy ground fire across its service life and kept flying. The pilots were proud of that. They were killing the jungle, they told themselves. They were winning. What nobody told them was that the jungle was also killing them, slowly, invisibly, in a way that would take decades to prove and longer still for the government to admit. This is the story of Operation Ranch Hand and the men who flew it. The idea was logical, at least on paper. Vietnam's jungles gave the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army exactly what they needed: concealment for ambushes, cover for supply routes, food in the form of crops hidden beneath the canopy. Remove the jungle, deny the enemy its shelter. In 1961, President Kennedy approved the use of chemical herbicides as a weapon of war. The program was originally called Operation Hades, a name so blunt someone in the Pentagon eventually had it changed to the more anodyne Operation Ranch Hand. The pilots who flew it adopted a unit motto that told you everything about how they thought of what they were doing. It was a play on the famous Smokey Bear slogan from American public service announcements. Theirs read, "Only you can prevent a forest." They were not wrong about what they accomplished. Between 1962 and 1971, Ranch Hand flew nearly 20,000 sorties and sprayed an estimated 19 to 20 million gallons of herbicide over South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Over 5 million acres of forest were heavily damaged or destroyed. Another 500,000 acres of crops were wiped out. Around 20% of South Vietnam's entire forest cover was sprayed at least once. 36% of its mangrove forests, ecosystems that had taken centuries to grow, were destroyed in a matter of months. Some sections of the Mekong Delta required only a single pass and never recovered. The weapon of choice was Agent Orange, named for the orange stripe painted on the 55-gallon steel drums it was shipped in. It was a 50-50 mixture of two herbicides, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, manufactured primarily by Monsanto Corporation and Dow Chemical. What the military did not publicly acknowledge, and what the manufacturers knew and did not volunteer, was that the production process for 2,000-4,5-T generated a byproduct called TCDD, a specific form of dioxin, which is among the most toxic compounds ever characterized by science. It is lipophilic, meaning it binds to fat tissue and accumulates in the body rather than flushing out. Its half-life inside the human body runs between 7 and 11 years. The herbicides were sprayed in Vietnam at concentrations up to 50 times what was considered normal for agricultural use. TCDD does not wash off a jungle in the rain. It does not dissipate with the season. It gets into the food chain, the water, and the bodies of every living thing that touches it. The ranch handers knew the missions were dangerous in the conventional sense. Flying straight and level at 150 feet over enemy-controlled territory, unable to maneuver, unable to evade, it was one of the most exposed positions any pilot could occupy in that war. Fighters escorted the spray planes on hot missions, dropping napalm and cluster bombs ahead of the formation to suppress ground fire before the C-123s made their slow, straight runs. Even so, the C-123s absorbed enormous punishment. Patches alone logged more than 500 bullet holes. The crew chiefs and mechanics who kept these planes flying lived and worked inside aircraft whose cargo holds were soaked, day after day, with chemical residue that coated every surface, pooled in low points, and permeated the insulation. Pilots on long missions ate their rations inside the cargo compartment. Some slept on the planes between sorties. They came home smelling of the spray. They washed it off. They went back up. The program ran for 9 years. In that time, 1,269 pilots, navigators, flight mechanics, and support personnel flew or worked with ranch hand missions in Vietnam. Nobody warned them. Nobody told them to limit their exposure. Nobody told them there was a contaminant inside the herbicide at all, because officially, the herbicide was safe. The companies selling it said so. The Department of Defense said so. A 1969 report commissioned by Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker, the American ambassador to South Vietnam, concluded that the three main herbicides, Agent Orange, Agent Blue, and Agent White, were not harmful to humans. The spraying continued. The first serious scientific alarm came not from inside the government but from a laboratory. In 1969, a researcher named K. Diane Courtney and her colleagues published findings showing that 2,4,5-T caused birth defects and stillbirths in laboratory mice. Within a year, the U.S. government restricted the use of 2,4,5-T domestically. The Department of Defense temporarily suspended Agent Orange use in Vietnam. Sporadic missions continued through 1970. The final ranch hand flight was flown on January 7, 1971. The pilots were not told why it stopped. They were not told their missions had been contaminating them. The veterans started getting sick in the late 1970s. Skin conditions first, chloracne, a severe and disfiguring skin disorder caused specifically by dioxin exposure, then cancers, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, soft tissue sarcoma, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, Hodgkin lymphoma, prostate cancer in men who had no family history of it, arriving years earlier than it should have, peripheral neuropathy, diabetes, and in some cases, birth defects in their children, babies born with cleft palates, skeletal abnormalities, and neurological damage. The veterans began talking to each other. They noticed the pattern. They started calling it Agent Orange disease, and the government, for years, told them they were imagining it. In 1982, the Air Force launched what it called the Air Force Health Study, a long-term project designed to track the health of ranch hand veterans versus a control group with similar demographics and service histories but no herbicide exposure. It was designed to run for 20 years. The Ranch Hand Veterans Association helped recruit nearly all 1,150 surviving participants from the original 1,269. 77 of the veterans were already dead by the time the study launched. 27 of those deaths were combat losses. The other 50 had died of other causes, illnesses that the veterans suspected were connected to what they had inhaled and absorbed on those early morning spray runs, though the study had not yet confirmed anything. The study ran from 1982 to 2003. Its findings were complicated and contested, but by the time it concluded, the link between dioxin exposure and cancer in ranch hand veterans had become impossible to ignore. By an act of Congress in 1991, a deadly health risk had already been legally presumed for veterans exposed to Agent Orange. The government had effectively conceded the point before the study even finished. But the story did not end with the men who flew the missions. It extended to the men who never went to Vietnam at all. After 1971, the ranch hand C-123 aircraft were stripped of their spray equipment and reassigned to Air Force Reserve units at bases in Massachusetts, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. The planes were recycled as ordinary transports. Nobody decontaminated them. Nobody tested them. Reserve crews flew them, maintained them, ate inside them, and slept on them, just as the Vietnam-era pilots had. The most famous of them, Patches, with its 500-plus bullet holes patched over and a history the museum curators were proud of, was eventually transferred to the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, where it was placed on outdoor display. Crews at Westover Air Force Base had been complaining for years about the smell coming from their assigned C-123s. In 1979, the Air Force sent investigators from its Occupational and Environmental Health Laboratory. They found black, viscous, odorous residue coating the interiors. They reported it was not a health hazard. There was a reason for that conclusion. In 1979, there was no reliable test capable of detecting dioxin. They were not lying. They were operating in the dark. When the museum sought to bring Patches indoors in the mid-1990s and tested the aircraft as a routine precaution, the results came back highly contaminated. The aircraft was moved outside again and eventually decontaminated. In 2010, the Air Force quietly destroyed 18 of the surviving ranch hand C-123s, cutting them up and smelting the metal. The official reason given was cost. Air Force internal documents, later obtained through records requests, acknowledged concerns about potential liability for Agent Orange contamination. The aircraft were not retired. They were eliminated, the roughly 2,100 reserve personnel who had flown those planes after Vietnam began filing claims with the Department of Veterans Affairs. For years, almost all of them were denied. The VA's position was consistent and official. Exposure to residual Agent Orange inside aircraft was unlikely to cause harm. The dioxin in dry form adhered to surfaces, the VA argued, could not be meaningfully inhaled or absorbed through skin. One veteran, a pilot named Bailey who had developed prostate cancer that had spread to his bones, spine, and pelvis, spent years fighting that position. He wrote to fellow sick veterans while undergoing treatment. He continued filing paperwork while the cancer progressed. In 2012, the VA finally approved his claim. He was one of the first. At least 10 C-123 reserve crewmen had already died of cancers commonly linked to Agent Orange before the VA began systematically reconsidering its position. In January 2015, the Institute of Medicine published its findings. The evidence indicated that the reserve members could have been exposed through multiple routes, and that some crewmen quite likely experienced meaningful increases in their risk of adverse health outcomes. The VA, faced with that conclusion, began processing C-123 contamination claims on a case-by-case basis. It was a partial, grudging acknowledgement, arrived at more than 4 decades after the last spray mission flew. The scale of what Operation Ranch Hand did to Vietnam itself remains staggering. The Vietnamese government estimates that 4.8 million people were exposed to Agent Orange, with around 400,000 killed or permanently injured, and 150,000 children born with severe birth defects. The Red Cross of Vietnam puts the number of people with health problems at around 1 million. The United States government has consistently described those Vietnamese figures as unreliable. The dioxin released during the war is still present in Vietnamese soil at 3 former American military bases at concentrations high enough to require active remediation. The cleanup is ongoing. The ranch handers flew nearly 20,000 sorties. They wore no protective equipment because the government told them none was needed. They ate and slept inside aircraft contaminated with one of the most persistent toxic compounds ever manufactured. Their planes were eventually destroyed to limit liability. Their claims were denied for decades, and the motto they adopted with such cheerful bravado, the joke about preventing forests, became one of the darkest unintentional ironies in the history of American military aviation. They prevented forests. The forests, in a way, returned the favor. If you want to understand more about the long shadow the Vietnam War cast on the men who fought it, there's a video on screen right now that goes deeper. And if this story made you feel something, subscribe. There are more stories like this one that the history books left out.